stuff since
similar format to
a similar format. There might be a little bit more larger number of questions, but not much larger. You will have enough time, I will see. Maybe I will give you a little bit more time than I gave you for the midterm, but essentially similar format, similar type of the exam, and a similar combination of different kinds of questions. Anything else? Okay, then. So chapter 3.8 is on schedule for today, which deals with the unemployment. 3.8 from the book Unemployment. So this is, you can define this as an applied microeconomic topic, and I will try to make it such because it is usually studied within macroeconomics. So those of you who've taken macro classes with me already, so you know that the problem of unemployment is a very important topic in macro, and that we spend quite a bit of time trying to disentangle and to understand the phenomenon of unemployment, employment. So I will try today to be a little bit more innovative in a sense to, while offering the basics about the definition of the concept of unemployment and why, to offer certain, let's say, microeconomic angle or microeconomic spin or microeconomic approach to the problem of unemployment. And in practical terms, that would mean a couple of things. First, that the prices that we will study unemployment within the context of the prices, the price theory, the labor market. The second thing will mean that we will emphasize the role of information in the labor market and how the fact that information is a positive economic good affects unemployment. And thirdly, equilibrium analysis, the market concept of market equilibrium applied to labor market. So I will talk a little bit or mention, at least in passing, the standard macroeconomic approach, like business cycle recession and how and what the governments can or cannot do to alleviate the problem of unemployment. That's one of the basic problems in macroeconomics, but for the most part, the emphasis will be slightly different. So let's get started. First, with the basic definition of the term. So what unemployment means. Unemployment doesn't mean the status of not being employed. So one thing that we have to bear in mind is that unemployment is not the same thing as not employment or non-employment. This means that unemployment is defined technically as being outside of the labor market, which means not being employed, not having a full-time job, while actively searching for the job. This is the operative word, is active search. So there are criteria of how your behavior or when your behavior qualifies as active search for a job, but that's the definition. In order for a person to be defined statistically as unemployed, it's not enough that the person doesn't have a job, it has to be actively searching for a job. Go ahead.
How do they know that there are people who are actually actively searching?
Oh, there are reasons, or there are ways of knowing that. For example, you are in the labor market Social Security Administration database, and you're actively applying for a job. So whether you applied or whether you, when they called you from Social Security, whether you accepted the job, if there was a job offer, and so on. So these are some of the criteria that they use to distinguish between active job seekers and people who are outside of the labor market. So one category of the people who don't have jobs are people who are actively searching for a job. These are the only people who are unemployed. They are counted as unemployed. Other people who may not work, but are not actively searching for a job, are not captured by these statistics of unemployment. There are different other ways how we classify or define those people. One of them is to call them discouraged workers. So you have unemployed and discouraged. There's people who may have actively searched for a job before, but at some point they gave up. So they're outside, they don't have a job, but they're not actively seeking a job either. We'll see why is that important. And I will say a little bit more about this in a moment. So first, what is the basis? What is the total universe of people who are taken into account when we talk about the unemployment? There is something called labor force. So labor force is all adult population. The age is between 60 and 65. I can say all people who are legally eligible to work. That's labor force. Minus something that is euphemistically called institutionalized population. That's simply prisoners plus people who are in mental health institutions and such, who actually cannot work. If you are in prison, you cannot legally work. If you are a mentally ill person in a hospital, you cannot work. So the entire adult population defined as being between 16 and 65 retirement age, minus people who are in prison or mentally incapacitated to work for a variety of reasons. So that's labor force. Then what would be the unemployment rate? You think a percentage of labor force that is actively seeking job? No. The unemployment rate is calculated as a percentage of people, as a number of people who are actively seeking job divided by the sum total of employed plus unemployed. So this denominator here is not the entire labor force. Why? Because you have those people here. So you can say that the total non-institutionalized labor force, the total pool of people who are eligible, who can work, comprises three components. Employed, people who have full-time employment, or who are classified as employed. Unemployed, plus discouraged, people who do not work and in the same time are not even trying to find. And the unemployment rate is calculated as a percentage of this narrower category.
Is that just the labor market or labor force on the bottom?
It's a labor force minus discouraged.
So employed and unemployed?
Employed, unemployed, plus unemployed.
What about people who are intentionally not working a job, like stay-at-home mothers and such?
That's a good question. They belong to this category. That's the reason why I put the asterisk here, because this term discouraged implies that all of these people would actually want to find a job and couldn't find a job, and they got discouraged and they dropped out of the labor market. Some of these people actually never tried to find a job, like stay-home mothers would be one example. More rarely stay-home mothers. But there is another reason to think about. We'll go back to this. And sometimes this might be a larger number of these people might be a good sign. You'll see there are some examples. I'll come back to this in a second after I define a few more categories here. So then, when you want to calculate another categories here, the sum total of active labor force, people who are either working or seeking for a job, when you divide that in total labor force, potential labor force, you get a labor market participation rate. That means, let's say you have 160,000 people who are either employed or looking for a job. And you have 180,000 people in this age bracket between 16 and 65 minus institutionalized persons. So then your labor market participation rate would have been something like 90%. So 90+% of people within this population participate in the labor market, either by working or by actively searching for a job. So it's usually assumed, so 20,000 people here are those discouraged people who are outside of the labor market. So staying-home mothers, or people who want to find a job but got discouraged after 3 or 4 months unsuccessfully trying to find a job, and they stopped searching, and statistics doesn't capture them anymore even as unemployed, because remember, in order to qualify as unemployed, you have to be trying to find a job. If you're not trying, you're not unemployed. Or it could be, so labor market participation rate is you divide employed plus unemployed with total population. You get some number, 90, 95, 91, 89. So higher the better. It's usually assumed higher the better. Why is it assumed that higher the better? Because it is usually assumed that most of those people are actually discouraged. That the stay-home mothers and other people who might have stayed home and decided not to try and seek jobs, that the number of people who do this because they are desperate and cannot find a job is far greater than the number of people who, out of their own volition, stay home. That's the reason why then the labor market participation rate is used as a signal of economic health of the entire economy. But one caveat that I was going to mention about this is that sometimes a declining labor market participation rate might be a sign. For example, in good economic times, some people might decide that they can quit their job temporarily. You have a family of 2, and one of them can decide, or a wife or husband may decide to quit the job and then go to college. So the economic condition is good enough that they can afford to live on one income and the other person can go to college. So the person is outside of the labor market not because she's desperate and cannot find a job. Actually, she quit the job in order to qualify for a better salary later on because their economic condition is good enough, so they can afford to live without one income. So sometimes people are not discouraged. People drop out of the labor market not because they're desperate and cannot find a job and they give up, but because they actually have optimistic projections about the future. And they think they can afford to quit the job and go to college and go to school and go to some retraining program or whatever in order to pull some kind of course to qualify for better jobs and so on. But statistically speaking, this percentage of people is lower than the percentage of people who simply quit because they cannot find a job. Percentage of these people who would be outside of the labor market anyway, like stay-home mothers, tend to be relatively stable. So it doesn't change very much. In the long run, it declines, but it's not a sudden decline like 20% in a year or something like that. It declined, of course, in the last 50 years. Far greater percentage of women are in the labor market, but it's a gradual and slow process. One piece of empirical evidence to show you why people, why economists usually don't like when the labor market participation is low. And the percentage of these people who drop out of the labor market and don't come back, why that usually means that something bad is going on. You know, when this happens, when the labor market participation rate in America dramatically declined, years 2008, 2014. What happened in that time period? The sharpest economic recession since early 1980s. Very bad economic times. And then as the economy got going and started recovering, the participation rate started going up from 2014, 15, and then in 16, 17, 18, it dramatically increased. So that means that people were that the jobs were not in offering in early 2010s, that economic conditions were bad enough that many people who wanted to find a job got discouraged and couldn't find one, and they dropped out of the labor market completely in desperation. So that's the reason why the official unemployment rate, this is important, but an important nuance here, that official unemployment rates are not very precise parameters to describe the conditions on the labor market because they don't take into account the labor market participation rate. You can have 8% unemployment rate, but with a much lower participation rate, you can have this hidden unemployment, which is much greater. If you have maybe additional 4 or 6 percentage points of people who are outside of the labor market completely, they got discouraged, you then have a very bad situation. So the unemployment figures in America 2008 to 2015 were too optimistic. That they were underestimating the level of economic problems because a significant part of the labor force was outside of the labor market. They were not applying for jobs. So then you have 8% unemployment rate and you have plus 5% people who don't seek jobs, who would be in the labor market otherwise. So you have essentially your effective unemployment rate is 13%, although statistically the official unemployment rate is 8%. Get this? And then when things went better in 2015, 16, 17, then the participation rate went up, and then the real unemployment rate converged to the official unemployment rate. Okay? Any questions about this? Okay, so these are just definitions of unemployment. Now, more theoretical stuff. Can anyone tell me what do you think the optimal unemployment rate should be? 2.5. Why 2.5? Percent. So that's the number. Let's 25 people out of 1,000 No, yeah, 25 people out of 1,000 people who are either employed or unemployed. Why not zero? Full employment, you know, our economy is full employment. Why it's never almost, why people talk about full employment and still we know that it's never going to be 0%. Why is the actual unemployment rate is never zero?
That's because I guess never mind. I came up with a bad example. Like if people quit their jobs, but they're unemployed for like 2 or 3 months until they can start their next job.
Yeah.
Are they technically
Irrespective of the reason. Irrespective of the reason. So, what could be the reasons that people quit their jobs? They find a better one, or they're dissatisfied with this one and they're confident that in a month or 3 months or 3 weeks they will find another job. So people quit jobs and find new jobs every day. People lose their jobs and find new jobs every day. So unemployment statistics, you know how unemployment statistics are compiled. What is the procedure? They don't literally kind of interview everyone in America. They cannot do that. The Department of Labor that compiles the statistics, they use the same similar methods for estimating. They estimate the unemployment rate by interviewing what's called a representative sample of American households, certain number of thousands of households in America, and they ask them questions about what is your status, whether you have in the last week, did you apply for the job, did you have a full employment or not? That's what they ask. They use similar kind of methodology that the opinion poll firms do when they try to predict. Go ahead.
Is there like a way that they could like look at like, I don't know, there's people who apply for like unemployment or whatever, and then they're like almost like registered in that sense. Is there like a way that they can like register people who are workers and then like kind of like look at those numbers and like, I don't know.
You mean people who are do they have a way to register people who apply for jobs and make sure that they really apply?
Well, I mean, kind of, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. That's how they do. They can check whether that's something that's really going on. The key here is that at any one point in time, you will have some people who will be changing jobs for a variety of reasons, and in many cases, this will be for a good reason because people are seeking better jobs. So since those statistics are always short-term, those are weekly surveys, you will always have some people who are unemployed. Even if you have zero unemployment that is caused by bad economic conditions, even if you have 10% rate of growth of GDP, you will have some unemployment always. Because even in the best economy, some people will be quitting jobs to find another better job. So just one example to give you, you have a person who works for Google, a highly paid 7-figure software engineer. She quits Google and gets, because she got an offer from Microsoft. She starts in 3 weeks. She quits Google, wants to have a 3 weeks vacation, whatever. Within these 3 weeks, that person would be classified as unemployed, statistically. You see, statistically, that person is unemployed. Unemployment statistics doesn't distinguish between somebody get laid off or fired because it's a recession and the labor force is cut by 20% in that firm, or a person switching from Google to Microsoft for a better salary or conditions. Unemployment statistics define both persons as unemployed. So that's the reason why you would have a certain level of unemployment even in the best economic conditions. And this baseline unemployment that will always exist is called frictional unemployment. frictional unemployment. That means there's a friction that the economic system doesn't function so smoothly, that the changes are not instantaneous and smooth. It takes time to change jobs. It takes time. Sometimes you quit your job and you are confident that you can find a better one, but it's not instantaneous. You have a search costs, information cost, often to find a better job. So this is frictional unemployment. This unemployment that stems from the fact that it's not easy and costless to change jobs. So now, what is this frictional unemployment? It depends how high this baseline unemployment will be. Depends on a variety of factors. In different countries, it will be different. In the United States right now, it's somewhere between 2 and 3%. So we know this because before the pandemic began and this economic calamity of lockdowns and shutdowns began, it was lower than 3%, 2.8, 2.9%. That's essentially full employment. That was a really good economy. So 3% rate of growth, 2019, early 2020. So that's in America, essentially the full employment. America has a very, very liberal and flexible labor market. So there are no excessive governmental regulations that will make hiring and firing people difficult. So this baseline unemployment rate is fairly low. But in other countries, it's much higher. In Europe is somewhere between 6 and 8%. Most countries in continental Europe. It's my favorite anecdote. I think that I mentioned this at least in one of my classes. So in France, is about 8%. That means in the best of times, there is no recession. It's good economic times. You will still have 7 to 8% unemployment in America. Why is that the case? This anecdote that I referenced a second ago is a good illustration of that. It's a story about my cousin who is essentially a Frenchman. He grew up, was born and raised in France. His French is better than his Serbian. So he used to work, he's a kind of IT guy. He used to work for BMW or Audi. I forgot, it was a long time ago. As an IT guy. And they were supposed to be fired because the demand for their services went down. And I remember distinctly calling him one day and asking, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm at work." So okay, I'll call you later. He said, "Oh, don't worry, I'm not doing anything here anyway." Sorry, excuse me. You're at work and you're not doing anything? Oh yes, I'm. What is the redundant? And they should have fired me, but they cannot fire me because the trade union is so powerful that it's cheaper for them, for the employer, to keep him at work doing nothing, playing Nintendo. I remember Super Mario. That was his favorite game. He was playing that the whole day and receiving like 70% of his salary. That's cheaper for his employer than to go through the arduous judicial process to fire him eventually. And that lasted for like 6 months, I don't know. And here, I think that he quit at some point because he's like a nervous guy. He couldn't stand doing nothing. But for a certain period of time, even him, that was for me a very good empirical test of this idea that unemployment insurance and is social welfare disincentivize people to work, because Bobby, my cousin, he is a real guy who cannot stand idleness, cannot stand doing it. Even he accepted a month or two of like free money for nothing, and other people would be even more tempted to do so. So then, what does this anecdote tell you? It tells you that in France you have a very high barriers to firing people, trade union protections, and administrative obstacles for an employer to fire somebody whom he doesn't need anymore are very much higher than in the United States. How does that affect decisions about employing people then in the first place? every obstacle to firing people is an obstacle to hiring people, because if you know that you will have a hell of a difficult time firing somebody if you don't need him, you will think twice or thrice before offering a full-time contract to somebody. So then the employment rate, the job creation rate in those countries with such heavy-handed regulation of labor market will be far lower than in countries like United States and United Kingdom that have much more flexible and less regulated labor. Then it shouldn't shock you that American economy creates way more private sector jobs than the entire European continent. Because in America, we don't have such regulations, not even close to what we have in Europe. So private sector is essentially union free, and the regulations of firing and hiring people are very flexible, relatively light. So then this baseline unemployment will be higher. If you have other factors beyond the basic realities of life in which people change jobs and that's not instantaneous, which means that somebody will be defined as unemployed no matter what. If you have higher unemployment rate, that we talk usually about the structural unemployment. There are some structural reasons why unemployment in the long term will be higher than frictional unemployment. So in France, you have structural unemployment that stems first from the fact of labor market regulation that reduces the rate of new job creation because people are discouraged, employers are discouraged by the high obstacles to firing people. The second reason is the unemployment insurance. It's a more generous welfare state, more incentives for people not to work or to refuse the job offers if they can. So a classic example of that was in America, this additional unemployment insurance that was a part of the stimulus package that was passed this spring. It expired in August. For people who are unemployed, who lost jobs during the pandemic, they offered $600 per week of additional unemployment insurance. So then the problem was that the employers were screaming. It meant that people, when you collect the usual unemployment insurance plus this $2,500 every month, you have really, in order to match that as an employer, you will have to increase wages dramatically, which increases your labor cost, which will bankrupt you. And it shouldn't shock you then in July and August when this expired that the unemployment rate started falling down dramatically because now people had a better incentive to accept jobs because the government dole was not enough to offset the costs of not getting jobs. So if you can get your even remotely close to your regular salary that you can get on the market while doing nothing, you better believe that many people will choose. So very generous unemployment insurance, although at the surface sounds nice and good and humane, can have a very negative effect on the labor market participation and the unemployment rate in the long run. So then you will have structural unemployment will be higher in countries that have a very generous, usually open-ended social welfare unemployment insurance. Essentially, there is a kind of a match, almost complete match between how easy you can lose your job and how easy you can find another job. That's the trade-off that always has to be made. So those labor markets that are least secure are the most productive. That's one of the trade-offs of that the market economy forces us to accept at every corner. And that's one of the sources of anxiety in the modern world, that people, it's not so much why are people against globalization? It's a globalization, international free trade and capitalism, they increase the incomes of everybody, from America to China to India to Africa. Everybody is benefiting in the long run. Whatever measure you use, it's undeniable. There is no way around it. And yet, more people benefit from this. It seems that they more detest the process. And it's not because people hate being wealthier. It's rather probably more related to this sense of insecurity and instability. Because prosperity and higher productivity goes hand in hand with a lesser degree of security and predictability. So Americans change jobs nowadays much more frequently than they did 50 years ago or 40 years ago. So this situation that you find a job in some factory and you work until you retire, that's a very rare situation. So yes, most people will be earning much more than before, but their social status and economic status will be far less certain and guaranteed. So people then don't like this. You know that stability is a positive good, and people tend to prefer to have stability. So now an economic system that offers many other benefits, primarily greater wealth and access to income, but imposes high costs, psychological and other costs in terms of unpredictability and instability, people tend to dislike that. So that's why, paradoxically, you will have a lower unemployment rate in America than in Europe, but the cost of that is that you have, a psychological cost is that you have a lower job security in general. Another reason that can theoretically increase structural rate of unemployment is technological change. Schumpeterian creative destruction. So if you have one industry that is heavily, comprises a significant chunk of the economy, and people are highly specialized in a certain type of work, and in the use of certain type of technology and productive process, and then somebody comes along and obliterates that by some innovation, that can create problems in terms of having a large number of people who now have a highly specialized training. They need to switch to something else. And this may require a long time and expenditure of resources. And in the meantime, you can have a higher unemployment rate because these people will not be so easily employable. So now what to do about that? I can tell you one thing, that quantitatively, when you try to compare the effects of regulations, taxes, employment insurance, and other government measures as a factors influencing structural unemployment and technological change, that this first group of factors is far more important, simply historically, empirically. These are much more transient, much more short-term effects, technological effects. So now there are three approaches what to do about the structural unemployment that stems from technology. When it comes to governmental factors, it depends on what we want. If we want greater security at the price of lower standard of living and lower wealth, then we should keep government interventions on the French time. And they never tried that. 5 French presidents tried to liberalize the labor market and to reduce the privileges of trade unions. They were stopped by the demonstrations, by a combination of political insurrection in the opposition in their own party and trade union demonstrations. So we can make a decision to do that. If we prefer greater wealth and higher economic growth at the price of lower level of job security, then we should do the American style. We should impose American style economic system. When it comes to structural unemployment stemming from technological changes, we can do 3 things. The first thing, do nothing. And say, look, historically, this is happening ever since the Industrial Revolution. We have never had a large unemployment in the long run. Those people find other jobs sooner or later. And it's much costlier to try and do something about finding jobs for them through the government than to live with the temporary consequences of some people not having jobs because of the technological change. So that's one approach. That's a free market approach. The second approach could be like a moderate middle of the road approach. For example, President Bill Clinton. In my other class, I asked who was Tony Blair, and nobody knew. Surprised me. Who's Tony Blair? Anyone else? Tony. B-L-A-I-R. Tony Blair. Nobody knows. You're young. British Prime Minister from 1996 until 2005, I believe. He was a Labour Party leader, but nevertheless, his ideological position was similar to Bill Clinton's. Like they call it the new economics or a third way. So they were essentially for free market, but for a certain level of government intervention, but far less than traditional left believed. So try to imagine now. Don't imagine it. I'll tell you what happened. Bill Clinton was elected. What year was that? 1992. 1993, January 20th, 1993. In a month and a half, you will see a replay of that. America, the inaugural speech by new President Bill Clinton, a Democrat, for one. And what left of that inaugural speech was one sentence that Bill Clinton said. And the sentence was, "The era of big government is over." Now imagine a Democratic politician saying that in 2020. He would have been eaten alive. So that was, Bill Clinton was a guy who was kind of centrist, middle of the road. Essentially, he would be, if you take into account his tough stance of crime and his abolishing or reducing the unemployment insurance and social welfare in America, welfare reform program, he would be something like a moderate Republican nowadays. And Tony Blair was similar to that. I can tell you just that Margaret Thatcher liked Tony Blair, said Britain will be safe in the hands of Mr. Blair. Margaret Thatcher, like the free market fundamentalist and the most right-wing politician in the Anglosphere in the last 3-4 years. So two of them said, okay, globalization is tough. Some people will be losing jobs, including our trade union supporters. But what we want to do about that would be simply to offer some temporary help to those people through retraining programs. So we don't want to give them an open-ended unemployment insurance, a safety net. You can just sit back and enjoy. If you lost your job, you don't have to worry about it. Oh no, you will just have a temporary means-tested help for you to retrain for some other job, and then it's gone. It's a temporary program to offset some of the costs of your retraining and finding another job for you. So that's a relatively limited approach that became popular with Tony Blair and Bill Clinton in the 1990s. The third approach is much more radical, to say we need to tax the technological change. Believe it or not, even some economists approve of this idea. So we need to discourage the level of disruptive technological change in the economy by taxing the innovation and using the proceeds to compensate the victims of innovation. So Professor Joseph Stiglitz of Princeton, I believe, Princeton, I don't know, it's a Nobel Prize winning economist. I swear, I read that as far back as 2005 in Serbian translation. One journal in Serbia translated Joseph Stiglitz's article. I believe it was from New York Times or something, translated, saying we need innovation, global innovation tax. Innovation is too disruptive, it's too costly. Only wealthy people, innovators, entrepreneurs, capitalists, they benefit from that, and highly skilled people who can benefit from this new information technological era. Only they benefit. The poor people, blue-collar workers, they lose here. So we need more social justice. In Stiglitz's view meant that we should take it easy a little bit on this disruptive innovation. And whenever you want less of certain type of behavior or certain type of economic activity, just tax it. Yeah. And you will get less of it. And then use the proceeds to compensate the victims. So this is the most radical approach, and it didn't went anywhere actually, apart from difficulties in how to define the innovation and how to determine tax rate. It's deeply unpopular because you will have to say that it's one thing to say we're going to tax speculation or some malfeasances by businesses, but everybody, even people on the political left, say that innovation is a good thing, and if you, whatever justification you do, people will get slightly skeptical about that. So we tend to accept that if I'm an innovator, if Steve Jobs or Bill Gates and somebody created a new product, a better product, it's even morally offensive for many people who are not on the political right to punish them for that. That's also a political obstacle to applying those kinds of ideas. We're almost out of time. There was one more thing that I wanted to talk about, but maybe we can skip it because it's macroeconomic policy. Just one sentence, I will finish with that. In addition to structural and frictional unemployment, you have something called cyclical unemployment. So that's the unemployment associated with recessions. And here, that's macroeconomics. What the government should do, if anything, to reduce frictional, cyclical unemployment. And the range of opinions is from doing nothing to what our government is doing now, trying to do. Give money to get another check, giving money to people to overcome it. Now, we don't have time now to discuss the details about that. Just bear in mind the definition of cyclical unemployment and the range of opinions about it. Okay, any final questions? No. Okay, so let's stick to the plan. I'll see you all on Wednesday. We finish the material for the semester.